Hi, everybody. I'm back, and so Sean, to talk to you about extensions, which I hope you all know are the third speeches on either of the benches. So the third speaker for the proposition and the third speaker for the opposition, otherwise known as the first speaker of the opening government and the first speaker of, first speaker of the closing government and first speaker of the closing opposition. That was a test to see if you're all awake. Clearly you're asleep. Sort of the three broad things we want to talk to you about in terms of the extension speeches are sort of the paradox that is faced by a closing team, and we will explain what that means, but there are some tricky, seemingly contradictory things that you want to achieve in an extension speech, so we will talk about that a great deal. What we think, secondly, are the most effective ways to approach the extension speech, and then finally some specific problems that you often face as an extension speaker and trying to come up with an extension.
So a couple of things about the paradox of being a member speaker, providing your extension speech. Obviously, you already know that this is your chance to introduce the judges to the second half of the debate. It's your opportunity to let us know where the debate is going to go from here. We've just listened to roughly a half an hour of debating, and now it's time to open the second half of the debate. The two primary responsibilities that you have in the member speech are, first of all, you need to deconstruct the previous speaker. You need to provide rebuttal to that previous speaker. And depending on whether you're the member of the government or the member of the opposition, you need to go about that in a little bit of a different way. If you're the member of the government, to some extent, you're trying to put into perspective what has happened in the first half of the debate. And specifically, or hopefully, you want to put that into perspective with the constructive matter that you and your partner are bringing to the round. In terms of the member of the opposition, your deconstructive effort needs to be directly responding to the new material that the member of the government has brought to the debate round. But then that leads us to the second responsibility. You need to add something meaningful to the debate. If you think back to Steve's lecture last night on adjudicating debates, he talked about the movement model of debate. At the end of the first half of the debate, the judges are going to be somewhere on that spectrum between believing that the motion is true or false. You need to move the debate further along in the judge's mind. You need to move that smiley face that he had on the graph a little bit towards the government side if you're proposition, or a little bit more to the opposition side if you're opposition. And your extension is the way that you add something meaningful to the debate. And we'll talk about that in a second.
I'm just going to add one quick thing there as well. The sometimes tricky thing about adding something meaningful at this point in the debate is that if your front half are good and do their job well, a lot of the more obvious arguments that you might have wanted to make have probably already been made. And so we will talk about this more, but oftentimes the something meaningful that you're adding is something a little bit less intuitive, maybe a bit trickier, and something new.
I suppose that made me think of something else too. We could just do this all day. I know some of the concerns that you've had, specifically in terms of creating the opening strategy, was, is it better to get everything out early on so that the second half teams don't have anything to talk about? And one of the things that we've all been trying to get across to you is that it's really not possible. If your opening team has put out 8 or 9 different arguments, the chances are they haven't really been able to offer logical explanations as to why that's the case. And so I was thinking about my experiences in China, and these are going to be completely hypothetical right now. But let's say that I have 2 days in Beijing, and those are the only 2 days that I have any opportunity to be exposed to Chinese culture. And Li Shi has offered to take me around on the first of my 2 days to introduce me to Chinese culture. And she starts off by taking me down to the Temple of Heaven. And we drive along in a car, and she says, this is the Temple of Heaven, this is where we came, where the emperors came, and people in the area came to do sacrifices and celebrate the changing of the seasons, all of those sorts of things. And then we continue along our way in the car, and she shows me Tiananmen Square. And we continue driving along, and she shows me the Forbidden City. And she says, this is where the royal family lived, this is where the emperor lived, isn't it fine and dandy and neat? And then we continue to drive along, and she says, oh, you know what? Here are some good restaurants. They have really good food there. But we're going to keep driving. Now we're going to look at Beihai and Hohai. Oh, and you know what? We really need to get out so that we can see the Summer Palace as well. This was where the royal family, the emperor, would go when they wanted to get away from it all and spend some time with the family or whatever. And, you know, we'd go out there. And, oh, you know what? I also need to show you the Great Wall, so let's head up to Badeling. So that's my first day in Beijing. Have I been exposed to Chinese culture? Sure, I suppose. But now I'm waking up for my second day. And Jing Kai says, I'm going to take you around. And he takes me to the Forbidden City. And he walks me through palace to palace, chamber to chamber. And he shows me what went on in a variety of different rooms, what different functions were being served in those areas. He showed me where the royalty would go and watch the Beijing opera and those sorts of things. And really starts to bring me in tune with a lot of the things that were going on in the Forbidden City. And before we leave, he also takes me to his favorite restaurant in town. And he introduces me to a lot of the food that he particularly likes. Now, if that's my entire day, I've only seen two things. I've seen the Forbidden City, and I've had a meal. But between those 2 days, which one really exposed me more to Chinese culture? Which one really made me have a feeling and an affinity, or developed an affinity for the Chinese people and Chinese history? I would say that it's the second. Even though he didn't cover nearly as much stuff, he actually covered way more stuff than I did on my first day. So you can always think about adding new material in that way. Doing a lot of different things doesn't necessarily mean that you've seen or understood a lot. So the paradox specifically of the second half. One of the difficulties that you're often placed into is that when you are starting the second half of the debate, you're both in cooperation with the opening team and you're in competition with them. You're in competition with, if you're the second government as an example, you're in competition with the first government team or the first proposition team because you're trying to be ranked ahead of them. You want to be ranked first instead of second behind them. But at the same time, you're both in support of the motion. You're both defending the basic principles of the motion that the tournament staff has given to you, that the chief adjudicator has given to you. And it's important that you demonstrate that you are in cooperation with that team while still showing that you're better than that team. And that puts you into a difficult position, but that's where the extensions come in, and that's what a lot of our focus of this presentation is actually going to be about.
And so I thought Logan put this really well the other day when he was saying he thinks about the government bench, and to a lesser extent the opposition bench, as a coalition government, where you have more than one political party who's forming a government, and they're trying to pass pieces of legislation, they're trying to get policy done, but they're doing it from different political perspectives. So for the purpose of this debate, or this bill, or this motion, they're working together, but at the next election, they're both trying to get a majority. They're both trying to be the government on their own. So they're still trying to distinguish themselves and show why they're different and maybe why they have a different philosophy or a different take on the world. But for the purpose of this issue, they have to work together. So it's this really difficult tension where you're both trying to be different from the team that's up the table from you, but you're still trying to support the same idea and not contradict them. So we will explain this more, but this is the paradox that you face as an extension speaker. And so as you see on this slide, what you need to be doing in an extension to be the most effective possible extension speaker is you need to add significant value to the discussion. This can take many, many different forms. As Sean was saying, a lot of times the form that this could take is by identifying something that happened in the front half of the debate that was maybe dealt with in a very superficial way and was only briefly mentioned by one of the speakers or only really analyzed for 20 or 30 seconds, and really deepening analysis on that point. We saw that a little bit yesterday in the demonstration debate, where in the opening opposition, Shako talked a bit about human rights, and she spent maybe about a minute talking about it. But then in the second opposition team rather, Nick went into a great deal of detail about human rights and what human rights are and what the implications of making unfettered internet access a human right would be. So recognize that your extension does not have to be something that has not ever been discussed at all, or the words have not been mentioned in any way in the front half of the debate. You can use material that has been brought up, but you need to do it in a way that brings something new and adds new value to the debate. You can't simply re-explain the same thing. So you're being consistent with the team, but you're adding new value, you're deepening the analysis, maybe you're bringing new examples or new analogies to support that idea. So that's one way of bringing an effective extension.
I think the last thing that was different from what we talked about earlier is that very last bullet that says memorable, develop a singular identity. I think one of the easiest ways or the best ways for the judges to remember who you are as a team is to just pick a single idea in the second half of the debate and make sure that all of your argumentation is related to that single idea. And that does a couple of different things for you. One, there's no question about what it was that you were debating about. But two, if you have an instance such as the opening half dealing with a variety of different issues, hitting a number of different arguments and those sorts of things, if you pick only one of those issues and spend almost all of your speech time, because you need to do deconstruction and those sorts of things. But if you spend most of your speech time dealing with those issues, or with that single issue, your judges will necessarily feel as though you have added a lot of significant depth to that point because you spent all of your time on that single point. And sometimes you can also accomplish that by theming. If you do have multiple arguments, if you make sure that all of those arguments relate back to a single theme, such as human freedoms, or catchphrases, justice, the principles of justice, or something like that. If they all relate back to some broader concept, then it will also help us to think of you as having a single identity with your partner.
And again, we saw this yesterday, right? With the closing opposition team, Nick said at the beginning of his speech, we in Extension are going to bring you something new. We're going to talk to you about the reality of internet access here in China specifically. And so while a lot of the philosophy and the ideas underlying the extension were consistent with what had happened in the opening half, the specific focus on China and the reality in this country was something that was very different, and it was also a singular identity. There were lots of different things that happened in the closing opposition's case, but they were all united by this one theme or one identity. So that's a great example of a really effective and powerful extension.
So the types of extensions that you can bring to the table when you're a member speaker, there's really three basic types of extensions, one of which is simply a new line of argumentation, a brand new idea that hasn't been discussed. You can think of those in a couple of different ways too within the new line of argumentation. You can have a new pragmatic consideration. If in the top half they were talking a lot about the effect on an individual's choice or the effects on an individual's health and those sorts of things, you might be able to talk about the impact on economics in the second half of the debate. So that would be a pragmatic consideration. You're bringing in a new real-world implication of the policy upon our society. But you could also offer a new line of argumentation that's related to a philosophical consideration. If in the first half of the debate, both teams were talking about the pragmatic issues, what are the nuts and bolts effects on our society in terms of economics, health, and those sorts of things, you might bring in a new line of argument that talks about a principled discussion. The reason why we ultimately support these sorts of things is because they promote social harmony, or they promote justice, or they promote freedom. That would be a new line of argumentation as well. And the third type of, or the third type that I can think of anyway, is a new line of argumentation, would be a legal consideration. What is the legal application? Is this policy within the bounds of what we consider to be legally acceptable or unacceptable? And you could, you could deconstruct the motion along those lines.
Another sort of new line of argument that you can use as well, and you see this a lot when you debate internationally, is if a debate in the first half is happening maybe more in a domestic context or in a micro context, often the second half of the debate will really broaden the lens and make the debate more international or more macro, Or conversely, if you have a debate happening in the front half that has an international focus, in the second half, if it makes sense and is reasonable to do so, maybe teams want to focus on one or a few countries or on a particular region that's affected by a certain policy and really go into detail with that. So you see that happening a lot as well. I saw a debate recently at Worlds that was very interesting that was about punishing communities for the perpetration of honor killings in the Muslim world. And the front half of the debate was very practical, and an extension that we got from the government team was one of the speakers spoke Arabic, and he gave almost a linguistic extension where he was explaining the linguistic underpinnings of the word honor in Arabic, which was very interesting and something I had never seen before, but was a really fantastic extension, and it was an entirely new argument.
The second type of extension that you could bring to the table is a real-world application of the discussion that's taken part in the first half of the debate. I think, as an example, you could take the honor killings topic that she was just talking about, which was that we should prosecute communities for if an honor killing has been committed within the community, we should punish the community as a whole. If we were to talk about theoretically in the first half of the debate why we might do that, the second half of the debate might examine that in the context of Turkey and really develop that idea. Or to take yesterday's debate as an example, let's say that in the first half of the debate, they talked about how internet access can actually inflame riots, can inflame resentment and those sorts of things within the population, and they explained why, but we couldn't actually see how that might happen. You could offer an entire extension, the way that Nick did sort of, by talking about that idea in the context of China. That would be providing an example or a case study of the material that was presented in the first half. That's not exactly what Nick did yesterday, but if the opening half had given the theoretical explanation, the second half of the debate could provide an application or an example of it. You could also create a hypothetical example that you could apply to a certain country or something like that.
And you can flip this as well, right? So if the front half of the debate is about an in-depth real-world application of something, the extension can be the opposite, right? Your extension could then become the more theoretical, philosophical analysis of the issue. So these things go both ways. It just sort of depends on what order in which they're happening.
And to some extent, that's what the third bullet is about when we say completing an argument of the opening. That's the idea that if in the first half they've given us this example and they say that historically we know that this is true because we've seen it on numerous occasions, the second half could actually come in and say, while we already know that it has happened in the past, I'm going to take this debate a step further by explaining to you why it has happened in that way, and therefore I will also be showing you why it's likely that the same outcomes will happen in the future if we apply this policy today. And so you're just, as Jess said, you're working backwards.
Oh yeah, and this is my favorite type of extension because this happens rarely, but sometimes you're in a very lucky position as an extension speaker where there's something very obvious that should have been said in the front half of the debate, and for whatever reason, your front half just doesn't bring it up. This, again, doesn't happen very often. What's more common is you'll get the third thing happening, where maybe your front half has briefly mentioned something and hasn't really prioritized it or analyzed it a great deal, and you think that that's the most important issue in the debate, so you're just going to make that your extension and really analyze the heck out of it. But sometimes they won't mention it at all, and then that's fantastic for you because you prepared it and you came up with it and you were convinced that you weren't even going to get to talk about it because you thought that would be something that would happen in the front half. In that situation where something very obvious that should have been said in the front half is not said by your opening half, by all means, make that your extension. It's usually something your judge would have anticipated and expected to have been said earlier in the debate. So an example here would be when we were talking about banning smoking the other day. If I was the closing opposition team and my opening opposition did not say anything about people's right to choose to smoke, I would be really excited, because that would, to me, is the most obvious opposition to banning smoking. And so that would be my extension, and I would spend several minutes talking about that a lot, and why that was the most important issue in the debate. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen a lot, though, because lots of people are very clever and will have said the obvious argument. But if you're lucky, it might just happen.
And to some extent, the what is missing is also just a check. Like all of the other extensions that we were talking about, you can sit there and you can think, okay, they've given me this argument, but is there a critical piece of that argument that's missing? And if you ask that question, what's missing from the debate? Maybe they've given us the empirical example, but have they told us why that empirical example is true? Or why that it worked the way that it did? So just ask yourself constantly as a debater, what is missing from this debate round right now? And a lot of times that can become your extension. Okay, so some example extensions. We've come up with just a couple of different, a couple of different ideas of where you could go with extensions. Jess just gave you an example of where you could go in terms of extensions with the banning smoking. But if the first opposition has only talked about choice, as an example, for the second half, you could offer an entire extension that's related to the issues of economics. Let's pretend for a second that the opening government said that we're going to ban smoking in all shapes and forms. The manufacture of cigarettes, the selling of cigarettes and pipes and whatnot, and we're also going to fine people who are caught smoking, whether it's in a public or a private place. So we're going to flat out ban smoking across China. We could then, as an extension, offer an economic impact. And we could talk about the loss of economic revenue in the economy, because we're talking about a number of different things being impacted, whether it's tobacco farmers, whether it's the companies and all of the workers who work in the manufacturing plants as they put together cigarette packages and advertising for these cigarette products or these tobacco products, and all of those jobs are now lost because of the proposition's case. You could also talk about it on a more individual level, and you could talk about how individuals are negatively harmed, not just the broad economy, but the individuals who lose their jobs, whether it's because they're a factory worker or whether it's because they work at a shop down on the corner, like right over here on the street. There's a little shop that sells nothing but tobacco. That person is going to lose their job if they can no longer sell that tobacco. And that becomes a very real impact on the individual. So that's one direction that you could go.
I mean, and just to make that even bigger, I don't know what the tax is like on cigarettes in China, or if there's tax on cigarettes in China. I don't smoke, but in Canada, there's a heck of a lot of tax on cigarettes, and the government generates a lot of revenue from the sale of tobacco. If you don't have that anymore, the government's losing a lot of money, so there is a broader impact there in terms of the government's ability to raise money, and then subsequently spend that on other things. So you've got tons of different ways that you can measure the economic implications of this policy as the closing opposition extension speaker.
And this second option as an extension is something that I actually borrowed from one of you yesterday in a conversation, that you could actually create an entire point around the public's backlash against a government policy that's similar to this. And you could talk about, first of all, you could set up your argument by saying, what is the government's responsibility within the Chinese context? And you could mention the fact, or you could build an idea around the fact that the Chinese government's stated goal is to promote social harmony and social unity and those sorts of things. And then you could talk about the notions of violation of choice, even though that took place in the first half of the debate. Even though the first opposition talked about issues of choice, you can then talk about how prevalent smoking is in our society, how it's commonplace, that everybody smokes all the time in restaurants and every place else. And it's just this very prevalent thing within our society. And then you could go to the impact level and talk about, so what happens when all of a sudden the government enacts this widespread or this sweeping ban on all smoking products, on all tobacco products? And you can talk about the social unrest that ensues. You can talk about the resentment that people have for the government because they're interfering with something that we took to be a given in our lives. You can think about issues in that aspect and think about how it disrupts the social harmony within our society, and therefore the government is not actually upholding one of the fundamental pillars that the government holds dear, and that in and of itself might be a reason to reject the motion.
And so you see how with that second extension, Sean's really cleverly used the choice argument as almost like a minor part of the extension. But the focus of that extension is something that's so much more than the violation of choice, and he takes it so much further that while he's still consistent with the idea of the violation of choice that came out of the first team, he's brought an entirely new contribution to the debate, and he's really moved the ball in terms of what the debate's about. So he's both consistent, but also quite different and interesting.
We just wanted to give you several different examples of extensions to help you wrap your minds around what we're talking about. So if we had the motion, this House supports corporal punishment in our schools, spankings and those sorts of things, physical punishment of children. We could look at a mock debate to see what the opening teams did. On the opening government side, we can see that their focus was primarily on education and personal safety. And the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister were talking about things like, we need to ensure that students, this is really an American topic, I think, but talking about how we need to provide for safety in the classroom. Students need to feel safe from bullies and those sorts of things in order to focus their efforts on learning. And at the same time, the opening government could put forth an argument that says that that right now there is bullying in the classroom, which in and of itself is bad because of all of the violence that ensues. And as teachers, as administrators, we need to provide for the safety of our students. And therefore we could use corporal punishment as a way to promote safety. In the second half of the debate, the government team could actually come in and say that instituting corporal punishment in our schools would actually reinforce the notions of justice within our society. If we do the model correctly, we could expose students at a very early age to the concepts of due process, as you have to investigate what had happened, and you go through an exploration of whether or not someone was guilty before you actually punish them, and those sorts of things. And so you could actually internalize the concepts of justice. Over on the opposition side, well, I guess that's a completely new extension, by the way. That's when I talked about a new line of argumentation, that would be a new line of argumentation. Over on the opposition, we could talk about how corporal punishment is actually a bad thing in the opening half by saying that it leads to a cycle of violence, that it sends the message that violence is okay, and that it creates this notion in students' minds that it's okay if you're bigger or stronger than someone else, that you can physically impose your will upon them and you can hit your partner at home and those sorts of things. In the second half of the debate, the debaters may have sat there and said, well, that's really what we wanted to talk about, but if we ask the question, what's missing, they could say, well, there's no real explanation of why it leads to the cycle of violence. So they could offer an extension which focuses on the sociological reasons and the psychology behind why you perpetuate cycles of violence. And you could talk about a number of different sociologists such as B.F. Skinner and other sociologists to really fill in the explanation of why it's going to cause people to fear teachers, why it's going to make them think that it's okay to use violence against other individuals.
Right, and I mean, I've only been looking at this now for like 2 seconds, and while Sean's been talking about it, but there's lots of other things that we could talk about as well, right? So I think there's generally this conception that there's a finite number of arguments, and that's never true. One that jumps out to me that could also be an extension for the opposition is something maybe about the learning environment in school and how the presence of violence and the ability for teachers to punish or spank or whatever that they're going to do to their students is bad for the learning environment, and it's not conducive to people acquiring knowledge. And so because the word schools is in the motion, and we always want you to think about what words are in the motion, we're primarily talking about an educational environment. And is the use of violent measures really going to be the best way to encourage learning? The opposition would probably say no. So there's lots of different things that we could talk about, both entirely new and deriving from the first half of the debate.
And what would be really effective about Jess's extension right there is that it actually goes back to the opening government, who says that one of the primary things in our schools is to promote a safe learning environment, and she's actually just turned that back upon the government by saying that by having the threat of this physical violence in our schools, you're actually undermining the ability of the students to focus on their learning. And the last example extension. This is going back to my lecture yesterday when I was giving an example of a motion that we could have. This House would prohibit the adoption of Chinese children by foreign citizens. The opening government could put forth a case that says that the reason why we should not allow this to take place is because it treats children as a commodity. In effect, we're selling, this is what they could argue, in effect, we are selling our children to foreigners. And it is, as a result of that, is that it's created a black market in which children are being taken from homes, taken from the street, and put into orphanages, and then going off to foreign countries. And we could also talk about increased corruption at the local level, where maybe officials are turning the other way or possibly even involved in it directly. So a couple of extensions that the closing government could bring in. We could talk about the value of Chinese culture, and we could talk about the implications of Chinese children being sent off to America or Great Britain or Canada or Australia or wherever it is, and they then have a disconnect with their Chinese roots, with their Chinese heritage. And that in and of itself is something that should be avoided. We could also talk about the cultural impact on China as a whole. How does the rest of the world view China when so many children are going off to other parts of the globe to be raised by white parents? I suppose I should probably say something right now, just because I know most of you know that Steve has 2 daughters from China, and you probably don't know that I'm also on the waiting list to adopt from China. So there's a very personal reason why I chose this as an example of emotion. But that being said, I just derailed myself. I think that it's entirely conceivable for the second government to then bring in these sorts of arguments that say that the reason why we should prohibit or ban the adoption of Chinese children is because of the impact on our culture as a Chinese people. And that's something that we value dearly and something that we should try to protect as much as we can.
And that's another great example, this particular extension, of using both sort of the micro and macro levels of analysis. So you're doing a lot of argumentative legwork with this. You're focusing on specific individual children and the impact of the policy on them, and then you're zooming out and you're looking at what the impact is on China in the world, which is a very sort of macro level analysis. So that's good, because you cover a lot of ground with that extension.
A second option is to develop one aspect of the opening government case and develop it in much more detail again. You could specifically look at that commodity issue and that black market issue, and you could answer the question why it's created a black market. And you could go through the process, the logical explanation as to why it's created a black market, that people are trying to get money into their pockets and those sorts of things, and that what's the driving force behind it. But then you could specifically look at a province within China, to look at some different orphanages, to look at some different cases in which this sort of thing has taken place. And then, finally, and most importantly, you would need to look at the model itself and show how the proposal of opening government, the proposal put forth by the Prime Minister, will actually bring change, will actually end this black market that might exist, and those sorts of things.
Okay, so this is my favorite slide, because this is, I think, the slide that generates the most questions when you're teaching people about British parliamentary debate and what an extension is, because I think the extension is probably the trickiest element of British parliamentary debate, and these are all the problems that can come up. And so we're going to try to talk about all of them, but obviously feel free to ask questions about any or all of these things, because these will come up, unlike definitional challenges. So the one question that comes up a lot is, how do you prepare an extension? When you're in the second half of the debate and you're the member of government or the member of the opposition, you have no idea what your front half is going to say. You don't even know what the Prime Minister will say, the Leader of the Opposition, or what direction the debate is going to take. So in that half hour, with your partner and your coach and your binder of handy materials, how do you prepare? Well, I'm going to have a similar answer to this as I had earlier when I was talking about being the opening opposition team. You need to be extremely flexible. And by that I mean you have to be ready for anything as an extension speaker. So you want to spend a lot of time in your prep thinking about, if I was the opening government or the opening opposition, what would I be talking about? What are some of the obvious arguments? Or what are any of the arguments that I could bring up? And you want to brainstorm as many possible ways of supporting or opposing the motion, depending upon what side of the debate that you're on, and generating as many different philosophies, stances, arguments, case studies, levels of analysis as possible. And doing this with your partner and your coach and coming up with basically a huge list of stuff. This is how I do it. In the debate, as the debate is happening, say I'm the member of the government, so I'm the third speaker on government benches. As the Prime Minister is talking and introducing his or her arguments and his or her partner's arguments, if I recognize any of those things on my big list of arguments, I will cross them off. So I will literally take a red pen and I will strike a line through the things that the Prime Minister is talking about as she's talking about them. And the second speaker for the government, as she's talking, if there's anything that she's talking about that was on my list, I will cross those things off as well. Now, I say that with the caveat that what Sean and I have been saying consistently is that you can occasionally use material from the front half of the debate, and that is true. If there's something that is underanalyzed or not well developed, then I can use that as my extension. But if I see the Prime Minister spending a lot of time and developing very well, say in the debate about banning smoking in China, if she spends 3 or 4 minutes talking about the negative health effects of cigarettes, as an extension speaker, I am not going to want to make that my extension because that is far too similar and has been far too well dealt with by the Prime Minister to make that my contribution. So I'm going to cross that off. So what I'm left with by the time it gets to my speech, hopefully, is a sheet where some things have been crossed off, maybe most things have been crossed off, but hopefully there are a few things left on my sheet that I can use as my extension. And so often the residue on my brainstorming list becomes my extension. Again, that's with the caveat that with what I have brainstormed is relevant in the context of the debate that's happening. So maybe there's a few things that I have left over. I want to think about the debate that we've had so far and which of those things best fits within the context of that debate in terms of relevance, but also in terms of pushing the ball in the debate and taking it further and taking it to a higher level. And so that's how I would handle the issue of preparation as a second team in a debate.
I think one of the unique advantages that you have of being in the second half of the debate too is if you remain flexible, if you've gone through the process of brainstorming the various ideas that are out there, you literally have more than 30 minutes of additional prep time. Because you not only had the 30 minutes since the topic was announced, you had the opportunity in that time to brainstorm with your partner and your tutor what you wanted to say. But then you had 28 minutes of speeches from the opening half teams where they're talking, and that gives you a lot of opportunity to think about what is missing from this debate. What have we not talked about yet? Or what have we talked about, but it wasn't really explained? And then you can sit there and start looking at your list that Jess is talking about, that you brainstormed on, and going, okay, I had this idea, that's off, they talked about it. I had this idea, ooh, that actually just reminds me, based on something that she just said in her Prime Minister speech, that I could actually go in this direction. With that same idea, I could add a lot of significant depth. So remain flexible and don't stress out on the lack of prep time. In some ways, you actually have an advantage because you have 4, possibly 5 speeches if you're the member of the opposition to think about what you might say.
So the second thing we have up here is following a difficult opening team. And this, again, is, I think, an issue that generates a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. What do I do if I am, say, again, I'm the member of the government, so I'm the first speaker for the closing government team, and my opening government has a completely crazy model. Like, their interpretation of the motion makes very little sense. And let's say the opening opposition hasn't challenged them on it. We're willing to debate it. So the example we can use here is, again, the one that Josh gave us earlier of the motion being about celebrity criminals getting higher punishments than regular criminals. And let's say the opening government defines it as the execution of Saddam Hussein. We should give him the capital punishment. What do you do in that situation as the member of government? You've spent your half hour preparing arguments about why celebrities deserve a higher criminal standard than regular criminals, and we're having a debate about Saddam Hussein being executed in Iraq. Well, what is almost always possible in that kind of a situation, and I've come across this lots of times before, is that everybody in the room, other than the person who has introduced this crazy definition or crazy model, realizes that what is happening is crazy and is not the debate that you're meant to be having. Your judge will recognize this. You will see this probably on your judge's face. They will be very unhappy. Your opposition will be unhappy. You will be unhappy. And so what you can almost always do in that situation is try to extract a very small and vague principle out of what they're talking about and then have the debate that you want to have. So in that kind of a situation, as the member of the government, what I might say at the beginning of my speech is, Madam Speaker, we've had a very interesting debate so far about the relative rights that we assign to people depending upon who they are in a criminal justice system and depending upon their level of fame or notoriety in a given society. We're going to continue with that theme by talking specifically about the issue of celebrity criminals in the United States of America and why they deserve a higher standard of punishment, just as Saddam Hussein does in Iraq, right? So you're not technically contradicting your front half. You're sort of being consistent with what they're saying, but you are shifting the debate massively towards what the topic is supposed to be. You're really allowed to do that because that's what the topic is. That's what you're supposed to be debating. And as long as you make an attempt to tie what you're saying in with your front half, everybody in the debate will be very grateful to you for doing that. So it's almost always possible to do that in that situation.
I think another way that you could deal with that example, and it's very similar to what Jess just talked about, is to say that, okay, they've given us a very specific example, a very specific celebrity, Saddam Hussein, and what I'm going to do for you, what my partner and I are going to do for you, is we're going to take a step back and look at it in principle, and talk to you generally why all celebrities should have this type of extra punishment or extra attention put on them when they commit a crime or accused of committing a crime and those sorts of things. So you can I don't want to say the word weasel, but I will. You can weasel out of the opening government's small definition by saying it's just an example of the overall topic that we've been given, and we're going to talk about the topic more broadly.
I'm going to skip down to the second last one because I think this relates quite closely, is this idea of knifing or shifting the debate. This refers to when, and then again, this is almost like a definitional challenge. It's almost never okay as an extension speaker to cut your front half loose. So that means to sort of explicitly contradict the front half of the debate. Basically, you should almost never do this. But again, like a definitional challenge, sometimes this is appropriate. The example that I will give is the one that I gave earlier when we were talking about definitional challenges. If we had a debate about all countries having the right to possess nuclear weapons, and the Prime Minister defines all countries as every country that elects its leaders, a democratic country, and for whatever reason the opening opposition hasn't challenged this definition, and we've had a debate so far about that, it could be appropriate as the member of the government to stand up and say, we would like to broaden this debate to talk about all countries. And while we agree with a lot of the analysis we've had so far from the front half, we're going to broaden the debate and talk also about non-democratic countries. Personally, strategically, I wouldn't do that as a member of the government speaker. Some people might, and that might be considered appropriate, but that would be a knife that some people would be okay with. I don't know if you agree with that or not. Maybe not.
I do. Even though, to some extent, that actually seems like it's contradicting what I said a second ago. I actually agree very much with what she just said. I think it's partially the way you go about approaching it. In the instance of what she just described, she was saying that we're going to apply it to all countries, and I think the very slight difference with what I had said a second ago was that I'm not actually going to say we're going to apply it to all celebrities. What I was saying was, in principle, this is why celebrities should be under increased scrutiny. And there's a very fine difference between those 2 points, one of which is shifting the ground drastically or dramatically, and the other one is just saying, I'm going to talk about a bigger principle than this micro issue that they've already talked about.
But as with definitional challenges and counter propositions, you should basically never knife your front half. There is always some sneaky, weaselly way that you can extract something from the 14 minutes that has come before you on the bench ahead of you, take that idea and use it as a tangential link to what it is you want to talk about and staying true to the motion. So try not to do the second last thing. The last thing on the slide, and I realize I'm doing this all out of order, again, relates, I think, a bit to the first, this notion of inflexibility. And this is a problem for the extension speeches, as it is a problem for the opening opposition. Don't be inflexible, is the big takeaway from this one. Be as flexible as possible. A lot of that will relate, as I was saying before, to your preparation. You want to try to generate as many possible ways of looking at the debate as you can in that half hour with your partner and with your tutor and with your materials. But as Sean was saying as well, you have the great advantage of being in the second half of the debate, having almost half an hour of people talking about the issue for you to think about it some more and try to come up with different new ideas, thinking about what's missing in the debate so far, what's been underanalyzed, what's just not here, and then using that as your extension. That allows you to be flexible. And I know being flexible is uncomfortable because you can't script what you're going to say, you can't write it all out and just stand up and read your speech. But that's good because that's not what debating is. So try to be as flexible as possible.
One comment to go back to the shifting the debate issue and why it's not okay and why judges will penalize you heavily if you either knife your benchmates or you shift the ground dramatically. You could look at it in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, debate, VP specifically, is a game. And to some extent, it's looking back at the idea, like Jess was talking earlier about how you formed a coalition government and you're trying to work together. But if you turn around and you actually directly argue against the opening half team, it undermines your credibility as a speaker because you have now just said that we actually don't agree with our opening half team. We're breaking our coalition ties. And when you do that, it makes your side much less persuasive in general. In other words, if I'm knifing my opening government team, I'm sending the message that or acting in favor of the proposition is not necessarily the way to go. I'm showing inconsistency between the two arguments. The second reason why it's not okay to shift the debate is because ultimately it undermines the educational value of the discourse that's being had in that debate round. So let's think about it in this way. I know a couple of debaters have mentioned this to me earlier, and I know it's a temptation of beginning debaters, especially to do this a lot. You listen to the debate that's taking place as the second government team, and after the opening opposition has spoken, you realize that there are some major flaws with the opening government's case. And so what you want to do at that point in time, or your inclination, is to amend their policy in some way, to try and get out of the arguments that were put forth by the opening opposition. Doing that shifts the debate dramatically, and judges are going to penalize you for doing that. And the reason why is that it actually makes it very difficult for us to understand the debate that's being had. In essence, instead of having a 1 hour long discussion on the topic, we are now having two separate half-an-hour discussions, two 30-minute discussions on two separate debate topics. And that makes it both less educational because we're not all talking about the same thing, but it also makes it difficult for the judges to determine who the better debater is. Because you have two teams who argued one debate topic and two debate teams, excuse me, who argued a different debate topic. How do I compare those teams in relationship to one another if they're talking about two different motions? It would be like one team coming in, or the top half of the debate, talking about we should ban smoking in China, and all of a sudden the second half debate is about whether or not we should stop cars from driving, and that people shouldn't be allowed to have private automobiles in Beijing. But how do we really compare those two sets of arguments that the teams are bringing into that debate round? And the answer is we really can't, and thus judges will tend to want to punish you or penalize you if you shift the debate dramatically.
And I guess this is sort of like a more advanced strategy point, but if that happens in a debate and you are the member of the opposition, so you're the first speaker for the closing opposition, there's been a case presented by the opening government and a kind of different case presented by the second government team. Strategically, what you want to do there as the extension speaker for opposition is you want to deal with both of those things. Because, for that exact reason, your judge is going to have to somehow adjudicate this debate. There are seemingly two different debates happening. So just from a sort of hedging your bets perspective, as the extension speaker for opposition, make sure that you're clashing and engaging with both of those debates. It makes your life more difficult, but strategically it makes sense as a debater to try to rebut both of those different cases, but hopefully we won't ever be in that situation because we should just be extending based upon what we've been given by our opening half. Just moving again in total random order. The fourth point about burnt turf, again, this refers to what Sean was talking about before and his 2-day tour of Beijing. I just don't think there is ever a situation where in the opening half of the debate, everything will be dealt with. I've seen lots of very, very good debaters debate, and this has just never happened. It is impossible in 14 minutes for an opening team to effectively deal with every possible argument for or against a motion. As an extension speaker, there will always be something that hasn't been said or as Sean was illustrating, has just been underanalyzed. So go back and make your extension an exploration of Tiananmen Square that has not been discussed in detail by your opening half when they just drove you by Tiananmen Square for 30 seconds. Do that, analyze it well, give the why, give the reasons, like Sean was talking about the other day. If you provide that depth of analysis, that's going to be an excellent extension. So don't worry about this burnt turf phenomenon. Don't worry about teams telling you they're going to have 8 constructive arguments. You should be excited if your opening half signposts 8 constructive arguments, because then you can know right away they're not going to analyze any of those arguments very well, and there'll be a lot of stuff that you can go into detail about.
If you also want to think about the ways that you can come up with more ideas in this burnt turf phenomenon, when you feel like they've covered everything, I named an awful lot of cultural sites in the Beijing area when I was going through that list of places that I went on day one. But if you sit back and you think about what did Sean not talk about, you can think of some additional types of places. Some similar ones, perhaps, the Lama Temple, the Confucian Temple. You could also think, maybe, well, what else has Sean not talked about in where he's gone? Well, I didn't see anything about China's modern history in all of that. Maybe you could take me to the Science and Technology Museum and talk to me a little bit about what China is doing today, what influence China has on the world today, and introduce me to that side of Chinese culture. That's something new that even though in day one I hit, 7 or 8 different places, there's still a lot of stuff about China that we still haven't talked about.
So the last thing up there that we haven't talked about yet is the failure to establish an identity, the third bullet point. And this goes back to what Sean was talking about at the very beginning of the presentation. That one of the most important things that you want to do as an extension speaker, and really as the Prime Minister and as the leader of the opposition, is you want to have what we've been calling a team line, you want to have a position, you want to have a clear stance, a theme. You want, at the end of the debate, for the judge to be able to say that the closing government team stood for freedom of choice, or they stood for the economic implications of this policy. They should be able to say in 1 or maybe 2 sentences exactly what it is that your team believed in as a philosophy. And it's not just you as the extension speaker. I'm going to encroach a little bit on the next presentation, but this is something that's going to be echoed, hopefully, in the whip speech by your partner. They are going to be echoing this team identity, this philosophy, this extension, and it's going to make you guys a cohesive unit of 14 minutes of awesomeness. So that is what the identity is about. And as Sean was saying before, you want it to be a singular identity. Sometimes I think there's a temptation as an extension speaker, because maybe you feel like you don't really like this one extension idea you've come up with a lot, and you've come up with a few more in preparation. So there's like 2 or 3 ideas that you want to have. Generally, and it's hard to talk in generalities, but generally this is going to be messy, it's going to be a bit more confusing, and it's usually better to try to focus on one issue and analyze that more than having 2 or 3 arguments that are sort of loosely affiliated and not as well analyzed. There is not the expectation in the extension speeches that there is in a prime minister or a leader of the opposition speech to have more than one argument. You can have one idea that is very well analyzed and have a lot of rebuttal, and that's an excellent extension speech.
The bottom line is just promote good debate. And what do we mean by good debate? It's helping us all to understand the topic a little bit more. If you pick one idea and analyze the topic through that one idea, that one argument, or you pick a very specific case study that really explains the issue in a way that the judges can actually visualize, it ultimately leads to a good debate because it helps us to understand the debate topic. And that ultimately is the goal of all 8 speakers in the debate round. But as the member speech, you're specifically looking for one thing that you can look to add to the understanding of the topic that was put forth. And that's it. So questions.
We're done. Questions.